Good afternoon. I'm here with my guest, Andrew Sofer, on Poet to Poet, Writer to Writer. I want to just fix this here. And Andrew Sofer is a professor, a distinguished scholar. He specializes in dramatic literature, and he teaches at Boston College, and he's interested in performance as an aid to textual interpretation. He'll explain what that means. A widely published poet. He has a new book out, well, not new, 2010 Wave, his collection of poetry. And he has this new book out, Dark Matter, that's a scholarly book on the theater, which we will discuss as well. So welcome, Andrew, to Poet, Writer.
Thanks for having me, Doug.
Now, you have a book out that Dark Matter that covers the invisible dimension of theater. How important, I was going to ask you, how important is absence in the theater? So in essence, the question is, does dark matter matter?
Yeah, I think dark matter matters so much that you can't have theater without it. That theater that doesn't engage with things you can't see isn't really theater, although, of course, theater comes from the Greek word for seeing place, so theater is where you see things. But I think theater is very much about stimulating the audience's imagination, and what you don't show can be just as powerful or more powerful than what you do show. And there are lots of examples of that. For example, Godot in Beckett's Waiting for Godot, the main character, or a main character, never appears. We only imagine him. We know he's there, but he's off stage somewhere. Or Macbeth's stagger, which is visible to Macbeth because it's a hallucination, but it's invisible to the audience. So we have to manufacture it in our minds with the help of the playwrights.
It's sort of like you said, what you don't say sometimes is more important than what you actually say, in a way.
I think that's right. I mean, I think that theater is built up out of the combination of things that are shown and things that are suggested, and when they work in tandem, you get something very powerful. Maybe another way of looking at it would be to think about horror and terror. Right? If you think about horror movies, you see the monster, you see the axe, you see the blood. But when something is terror, you hear the scream, but it's off the screen. And you have to imagine it.
It reminds me of a story by Flannery O'Connor, where people are being murdered off the, I forget the name of that story, A Good Man's Hard to Find, or something like this.
Yeah, maybe that's it.
Yeah, and there's actually, you never see people being killed, you just hear them screaming in a ditch where they're being slaughtered.
Right, so horror can be disgusting and awful, but terror is kind of creepy and uncanny and stays with you and is very disturbing, and I think that playwrights are really kind of keenly attuned to the ways that the audience's imagination can build and build and build and build and build if they're not shown the things that are kind of teasingly kept off stage. I mean, some things are off stage because they just can't be brought on stage, but other things could be brought on stage but aren't brought on stage, like the love scene between Bottom and Titania in Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, which takes place between acts, and you don't really know what they're up to, and that ambiguity is part of the play.
It's really that indie film that came out was groundbreaking, where you actually saw nothing happen, but it was a horrifying. They were in the woods, and these people would just suddenly disappear. It came out about
the Blair Witch.
Yeah, the Blair Witch Project.
Yes, yeah. I couldn't watch it. I was too scared.
And nothing. And you actually never saw anything.
You never saw anything, but you heard things, and the sound was so eerie and so frightening. And theater is very magical. Theater is often, I feel like in film, things are done for you and to you, and the camera is hungry. The camera wants to show you something. The camera has to show, or even has to show you something. But in theater, there's a lot left up to the audience's imagination. You have to kind of fill everything out. And I think it's that imaginative filling out that I was trying to get to in my book, because I think playwrights have always known that what you don't see on stage, that dark matter, is so compelling, and part of what gets the audience engaged, so that the theatrical event itself becomes a kind of collaboration between the actors on the stage, the language of the playwright, and then the imagination of the audience, and they're all working in concert to create something that's much greater than what's literally visible on stage.
Fascinating. Now, I noticed you have written about, no, in your collection Wave that came out in 2010, and part of it is about the memory of your father. And I think we all reach a stage where we see our father's face in the mirror.
Yes.
And have you, and do you like what you see?
Ooh, that's a wonderful question. I think that it's true. My father died in his early 50s in 1974 when I was 9 years old, very suddenly, of a brain aneurysm. And I was 9, my brother was 11, my mother was out of the country visiting a sick parent. It was very traumatic. And that wave kind of reverberated for me. And I'm now getting to the point where I'm just a couple of years shy of how old that my father was when he died. And he was an academic like me. He was a sociologist, not a theater guy, but I've sort of followed that line, that professional line of his going up. And the epigraph to my book is actually very germane to what you just said, because it's a line from Yehuda Amichai, the poet Yehuda Amichai, and for the sake of remembering, I wear my father's face over mine. So I think my book is sort of about all the ways that we do wear our father's face over ourselves, especially as we get older and become parents ourselves, perhaps, or not.
Amichai, I had a guy on here who was a major translator of him, Bernard Horn. Are you familiar with Bernard?
No.
Yeah. Just a great poet.
Yeah. Do I like what I see? I like to think about the ways in which I try and carry on some of the things that he was. He was a very just lively, engaged, passionate man who had many interests, and I've always admired that. He was also very witty and loved playing with words, loved making up children's stories. He was a cartoonist, which I'm not.
So he didn't take himself too seriously.
No, he had a sense of humor. He was able to play, and I think he wasn't an artistic person, but his creativity came out in his ability to play and his ability to play with children and be playful in life. And that is health, right? Play is health. So, I guess to the extent that I try and be playful in my poetry, it's sort of a homage to him.
Now, you've written about the use of props in Beckett's plays. Can you talk just a bit? I know it's a huge subject, but I noticed in your resume that you wrote an article that sort of appealed to me. Appealed to my interest was about props in Samuel Beckett's plays. And there's not an elaborate amount of props. I mean, from plays I've seen, either the heads are sticking out of the sand or they're, something like that.
Yeah, they get less and less. I've always loved the plays of Samuel Beckett. For me, they are the most sort of theatrical plays of the 20th century. And I got interested in writing about objects because objects are talismanic for actors, performers, directors. They fight them, they love them. It's a love-hate relationship when you're an actor and you're wrestling with a prop. I think Beckett understood that, and he kind of put that struggle between the human and the inanimate object into his plays. And so what you have in Beckett's plays often is a relationship where, just like the human beings who just seem kind of dropped out of nowhere and have to figure out what they're doing on stage, the props are also dropped out of nowhere. They're very alienated, they're estranged, they're odd, they're often distorted. Beckett really wanted his props to be distorted in some way so that they wouldn't be realistic. And you have a kind of comical struggle between the human beings in his plays and their objects, where they're trying to get the objects to serve them, and the objects are saying, well, thank you, I'm not going to be useful to you. Not only that, but I'm even going to refuse to symbolize. So if you think of the famous tree in Waiting for Godot, his first play, where there's really almost nothing on stage, except a tree. And the two tramps who are stuck under the tree, they're tethered to it. They spend the whole play trying to make use of the tree to hang themselves. It doesn't let them do that. And then they try and make it symbolize something, and it refuses to symbolize something. So I feel like in Beckett's work, the prop or the object or the set piece in some ways it's comical, in some ways it's a kind of existential insult to the human being who's simply trying to manipulate the world and get somewhere.
As much as the conversation, this chattering, this senseless chattering goes on. I mean, in the sense that it's an existential despair there, and the props are just sort of props of despair in some sense. Do you think?
I think they are props of despair. I think they add insult to injury.
Yeah.
They add insult to injury by refusing ever to serve the people who are trying to get them to work. I mean, another prop that I wrote about is from Happy Days, which is a play in which a woman appears on stage. We don't know how she got there. She's buried up to her waist in earth, and then she's buried in Act 1, and she's buried up to her neck in earth in Act 2. And in Act 1, she's comforting herself because she still has the use of her hands with all these props that she's taking out of a handbag that she's using to pass time and play with. And there's a pistol there to sort of comfort her, I suppose, so that if things get really awful, she can shoot herself. At least that's how I understand it. And then in the second act, she's up to her neck and she can only look at the gun, but she can't reach it. And that's sort of what I mean about insult to injury. The gun is kind of teasing her with the possibility of an extinction that she can never actually experience, because I guess for Beckett, death really isn't a human experience. We're sort of stuck in time. We're creatures in time, and we have to fill that time somehow.
Well, you know, the old saying about Beckett is you watch his play and nothing happens twice, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Now, I read in a review of your poetry book that you believe, or at least the reviewer believed, that every detail, no, let me get, you're sort of opposite of William Carlos Williams, with not in ideas but in things. You say things are
no things but in ideas.
No things. No, that's what you say. No things but in ideas. So tell me, Williams always say, stop with all these big abstract ideas in your poetry, get down to, the brass tacks. What are you saying? You're just a little...
Yeah, I don't write my poems based on ideas. I never have a thesis or a philosophical point that I'm trying to get across. I do try and start with the concrete very much in my poetry. Many of my poems are very rooted in a particular place, for example, and the details of that place. Sometimes I'll even do research into a place to make sure I've really got the sense of it. So I don't think that I would claim that I'm a philosophical poet or that my poems are about ideas. I mean, if people find ideas in them, I'm delighted to do that. But something I learned from Seamus Heaney, who was a very important poet for me when I was young and still is an important poet for me, although we've lost him, is to never use an abstraction when something concrete will do. So
you don't diverge from Williams at all?
I don't know if I don't know enough about Williams to be able to say for sure, but I do try and write concrete poetry in the sense that if I know the name of a tree, I'll use the name of the tree rather than just say tree. Accuracy is very important to me. I try and be very, very accurate in my language. If I'm describing something, I want to find the right word to describe it. And paradoxically, the more concrete I can become in my poetry, the more it seems to kind of lift into that dimension that maybe your reviewer was thinking about. I'm not sure which reviewer you're...
Main Street Rag. Some reviewer on the Main Street Rag, I believe it was. Oh, no, this was contemporary poetry.
Right, yes. Yeah. Yes, Contemporary Poetry Review did review my book.
Right, actually the guy was from Somerville.
Yeah, that's right. Bill Coyle, very, very fine poet and a wonderful writer.
So I don't know at his point. I guess I skewered his point, but in fact, it seems that you are in the William Carlos League, not in ideas but in things or something like that.
Well, I like to start there. I guess I feel that...
Yeah, start there.
In a way, I think maybe Billy Collins said, you want your reader to end up in Mars, but it's easier to end up in Mars if you start in Scarsdale or something that equivalent. Right. Give the reader an anchor in reality, something where the reader can locate him or herself, a door into the poem, a ground to stand on, and then you can go anywhere, right? So my poems are associative. They do leap around. They certainly do strange and complicated things with time. But I always try and have a place where the reader can ground him or herself to start off with, so that I'm not plunging them into something completely surreal to start off with.
Now, we're discussing the fact that we're both Lunsmen and fellow Jews, and you teach at Boston College, which is a decidedly Roman Catholic institution. I was going to ask you, how is that for you?
Well, I like the fact that my students take religion seriously, and also that they have knowledge of the Bible, because I teach English literature at Boston College, and it's very difficult to teach English literature if students don't have a sense of those biblical templates, the stories behind them, because English literature is, foundationally invested in those narratives, certainly tweaking them, twirling them, and so on and so on. So I actually really appreciate in my students the fact that they take religion seriously and that they have familiarity with the great sort of religious literary, texts of the Bible. And in terms of being a Jew teaching at Boston College, we have a Jewish studies program. I'm an affiliate member.
I mean, after all, this is Judeo-Christian heritage, right?
It is the Judeo-Christian heritage, and also Boston College is a Jesuit Catholic institution, and of course, the Jesuits are very, very committed to intellectual inquiry and openness. I understand that that's, gotten them into some trouble with the church. I'm not a church historian, so but that's my sense of it. So I found it a congenial intellectual environment, and it's certainly been sort of interesting being Jewish and teaching there, and I sort of as I said, I've appreciated the opportunity, and BC has been very good to me over the years.
Thank you. All right, so you have about 11 minutes now to read work from Wave. You're relatively new book. Not even relatively anymore. It's 2014 from your book. Well, whatever you want to read, for that matter.
Well, thank you very much.
You can read from whatever.
So my book Wave is it's a narrative sequence, and it starts in childhood and moves to adulthood, and most of the poems in the first part of the book take place in England, because that's where I grew up until I was 18. And then the middle section is about life in Israel in the 1980s, and then the third section is poems of New England, and the arc of the book is the speaker coming to terms with the loss of his father, and then kind of moving on into adulthood and becoming a father in his own right, which we were talking about a bit earlier. So I'm going to start by reading the very, very first poem in the book, which is called Wandlebury Ring. And Wandlebury Ring is one of those magical places of childhood. It's the site of an Iron Age hill fort in Cambridgeshire, and I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Wandlebury Ring. October, and a mist drifts from the fens. I'm 8 years old, and standing on the downs of Gog Hill with my family. It's Sunday, and my brother and I rose early to pack our lunch and load the stuttering car. Now we race jagged kites into the air, wrestling a wind that tugs our fingers numb. Our father shows us how to make them climb and twirl like German bombers in the war. He falls over, plays dead, then swallows air to chase us screaming round and round the hill. We make him keep on bombing us until we flop down and gaze northward toward the wash. I imagine stilt-legged fenfolk crossing marsh 200 years before, when farms were drowned. Now, skylarks, peewits, skirl over lowland, Gog and Magog, sleeping giants, stretch away. Below us are the woods of Wandlebury. We wander into a thick glade of beech, then tread our muddy circle round the ditch that ancient Britons dug to build their fort. Father tells how Romans tore it apart, burning bricks from soft East Anglian clay to mount their rounded arches toward the sky and pave the Via Divana to Haverhill. Down the scarp and into the ditch we tumble, tramping like soldiers through the fallen leaves that crunch beneath our feet. The barrow graves where Romans piled their dead lie further north, but here we roll ourselves in rich black earth, then clamber up the bank, smelling of leaf mold, wood smoke, dirt, and ash. It's a relief to shiver and find ourselves on sunlit lawn, leaving behind the glade and red hawthorn for the cobble drive. We cross the slippery bridge and peer together over its mossy edge at hungry ducks, the sunken cricket pitch's forget-me-not. Behind me lies the ditch, where today it is my father's shade I see, kicking dead leaves aside to unbury me.
Nice.
Thank you. I'll read a poem from the middle section, which is about what it's like to live in a country where all kinds of eras of history are smushed together and all kinds of ethnicities and peoples are smushed together, living under a great deal of tension, tremendous energy, but also tremendous tension. And sometimes when you live in Jerusalem, you can feel a little bit crushed by it. And this poem's called Old City, and it's a sort of dream poem. It takes place in the Old City of Jerusalem, which is the walled old section, which is itself a kind of microcosm of that energy, because it's, again, different quarters, different enclaves, living cheek by jowl. And this poem is written in a form that's called a rondo redoublé, which is a form in which the first 4 lines of the poem come back in the course of the poem at the end of successive stanzas, and then the poem ends where it began. Old City. In dreams, I walk your streets past every door. The muezzin calls the blind and lame to prayer. I have forgotten what I came here for. I look behind me, but there's no one there. Damascus Gate. Soldiers are everywhere. One tips a beggar's cup onto the floor. My coffee's cold. Some children stop and stare. In dreams, I walk your streets past every door. 3 mangy cats circle outside a store. I squint against the quarter's sudden glare. Is this the place? Have I been here before? The muezzin calls the lame and blind to prayer. A shutter clangs. It isn't my affair. The waiter seems to smile, but I'm not sure. I pay the bill. The cats aren't anywhere. I've forgotten what I came here for. The children follow me beyond the door. I sweat, pick up the pace. The children stare. My footsteps echo like a slamming drawer. I look behind me, but there's no one there. I turn the corner where a winding stair leads to a blind alley with no door. The beggar shuts his eyes and chants a prayer whose words scatter like coins upon the floor. In dreams I walk.
Sort of dark matter in there.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. It's full of dark matter. It's full of dark matter. I'll read a poem from the last section that kind of goes to this question about becoming one's father. It's a poem for a new child, and it's spoken in the voice of the son who's become the father. And he's trying to solve the Zen riddle, the Zen koan, show me your face before you were born, famous Zen riddle. And along the way to solving this, he has an encounter with Blanche Dubois from A Streetcar Named Desire, as one does. And this poem is written in a Persian form called the ghazal, which is a series of unrhymed couplets, but each couplet ends with a refrain that comes back every 2 lines, and there's a rhyme word. And you're supposed to sign off with a pseudonym in this poem. which I don't quite do, but it might be helpful before I read it to know that my last name, Sofer, is the Hebrew word for scribe, and that my father's first name was Sil. So this poem is part of a larger poetry sequence called Kenning, but this one's called Riddle. Show me your face before you were born. What left its trace? Before you were born, singularity blossomed. Its needle's point wove time into space before you were born. A mirror hung in the balance and shattered. We threw salt just in case before you were born. You lodged in the reeds. Pharaoh's daughter knelt in embrace before you, we are born. Heartbeats saccade, hoofs capriole galloped apace before you were born. Sometimes there's God so quickly, said Blanche. Ineffable grace, before you were born. Child, in sleep you climb ladders of air, dreams held in place before you were born. I, a scribe, write in my father's Cyrillic. His was my face before you were born.
Nice. We still have more time. So.
We do. That's great. So let me.
By the way, this book was put out by Main Street, right?
That's right, Main Street. Right.
I was in their magazine many years ago. I did ask you a question. I thought I saw your name in a poetry magazine many years ago that we both were in. We were never in the Harvard Mosaic.
I was never in the Harvard
Mosaic,
I think. Maybe I'll read a love poem. How about that? That's not a bad place to end, is it?
All right. Your wife's watching, right? Well,
I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope so. So this poem's called Cathedral, and the cathedral in the poem is the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. When I lived in D.C. in the early 90s, we lived in an apartment that was not that far from the Washington Zoo, and we could hear lions roaring occasionally from our apartment. And so that made me think about Africa, which is where my father was born. He was born and grew up in Cape Town. And there's a reference in, I think I'm in the wrong poem here. Let me see if there's anything I need to say about this particular poem. Looks like not. Okay, so here it is, Cathedral, Washington, D.C. I discover the cathedral through bare trees that only a few weeks ago were full, but shed a mottled canopy of leaves. Sitting at your oak desk, I feel the pull of these new days spent leaning into you, testing the weight of silence against words. A narrow window offers me a view of quiet air, and a crow's